Wir haben jetzt über Selbstregulation als Grundlage für Bildung und Lebensverläufe gesprochen. Unser nächster Keynote-Speaker verschiebt den Fokus auf Emotionen, Gruppen und Gesellschaft. Was passiert, wenn Jugendliche in einer Welt leben, in der Emotionen ständig angestoßen, verstärkt und bewertet werden, online und offline?
Professor Dr. Argyris Stringaris ist Professor für Kinder- und Jugendpsychiatrie am University College London und Co-Director des IM-Labors. Und er forscht dazu, wie emotionale Dysregulation, also diese emotionalen Ausreißer, entstehen und wie sie mit psychischen Erkrankungen zusammenhängen und was Jugendlichen hilft, ihre Gefühle in sozialen Kontexten besser zu regulieren.
Er macht deutlich und ist auch jetzt schon da.
Don't worry.
Emotionale Selbstregulation ist nicht nur eine individuelle Fähigkeit, sondern hängt eng mit sozialen Gruppen, mit gesellschaftlichen Rahmenbedingungen und mit der Art zusammen, wie wir über Gefühle sprechen, in Familien, in Schulen und Medien.
Please come in the middle, why not?
Yes.
Genau, oder anders gesagt, es ist ein Unterschied, ob ein Jugendlicher einen Wutanfall eben im Wohnzimmer, im Klassenraum oder auf einer Social-Media-Plattform hat und die Likes und Kommentare live mitzählen. Seine Keynote heißt Revisiting Regulation, Why and How Young People Regulate Emotions Within Groups and Society. Und wir freuen uns sehr, dass er heute hier ist. Thank you so much for coming. A big applause.
The stage is yours.
The stage is yours.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, es ist mir eine große Freude und auch eine Ehre, vor Ihnen vortragen zu dürfen. Ich wollte Ihnen mein Deutsch nicht antun und werde deswegen auf Englisch vortragen. Also ich werde jetzt auf Englisch anfangen zu sprechen. I'm very honored, as I said, to be here. I was delighted to hear before and reassured when Professor Hedwig said that the Leopoldina had a very long tradition of free speech and that they insist on that, which is really great because I'm going to be committing something apostatic today, Glaubensabfall in German, which is to dissent from views on self-regulation in some ways. Let me just say why I think we need to revisit things. Why care about regulation, first of all? Well, most mental disorders, and I have a background in psychiatry, most mental disorders can be conceived of as regulation problems. I'll show that. And what is mood or emotions, if you can use them synonymously in this particular case, and why do people have them and why do they regulate them or dysregulate them? I think this is a very important question. And I list some of the reasons why they do this. And what does this mean for clinical and policy work? So I'll start with a very simple vignette. Just look at this child, a 9-year-old boy with a diagnosis of ADHS and some learning difficulties, some reading difficulties. And you can see the degree of emotion regulation there is there, right? It's a very characteristic case of stuff that you will see either in the consultation room as a psychiatrist or as an educationalist very often when this comes to you. So, the vignette was written for a book that we wrote. In German, one would say in Struwwelpeter-artiger Art und Weise, they would say, der zappelt sehr viel, so wie ich zum Beispiel. And you can see that emotion dysregulation. I have a problem with the self. Philosophically, I'm not quite sure what the self is, you see. So self-regulation I find problematic for that reason to start with. Emotion is also very problematic, as is mood, but not as problematic as self. So I'm using emotion and mood today just because it's partly easier, I believe. Fewer assumptions. So in terms of emotion dysregulation, you can see that pretty much any psychiatric disorder can come under emotion dysregulation, right? Positive emotions, negative emotions, pretty much everything. You could put bipolar under that, depression, anxiety disorders, and even neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism and ADHD have so many problems with emotion dysregulation, often when they come to you, not per se, but often, that it's worth thinking about these problems there too. Now, as you know, mental disorders are thought to be very, very, very important. Now, how can I point to... Can I point somehow to? Yeah? I can see a cursor moving, but I'm not sure I'm moving. I don't have agency, you see. Right. So anyway, can I click down? Yeah. Anyway, if you look at the left, these are like pyramids, right? Like Obelix is sort of menhirs. If you look at the left, right, the thickness of the pyramid is the biggest in youth, right? And this is mental disorders, whereas the pyramid is fatter as you go up for all sorts of other disorders, including cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, neoplasms, which is the same thing as cancer. So depression and anxiety in particular cause the biggest burden of disease and years lived in disability in young people all around the world. This is not just the first world problem. Okay, now, moreover, as you've seen before, anxiety and depression problems by self-report and also diagnosis are increasing all around the world. Right? Well, in many places in the world, I should actually say. And so you can see here data from between 2009 and 2022, and anxiety and depression symptoms have been going up by about 30% in girls during that time, self-reported. So that's quite an issue. More importantly, and lovely data that you can get from publicly available about public schools and what we call state schools in the UK and independent, i.e. private schools, what we see is that special educational needs have increased. So people say, I've got autism. So we've got at the moment about 3% of people having autism, according to these data at least, which is far above what one would expect according to the epidemiological prevalence. Moreover, you can see a kink in English, right, at around 2014. Remember that, it's when the law changed. I'll come back to that. Now, the same thing you will see in university students, where you will see that if you take, this is percentage increase compared to 2010. So think about it as a bit of a differenzierung rather than do you see what I mean? Like take that as a base and then you see the percentage increase from there. So what you see there is that the percentage increase for mental health symptoms has been vast between 2010 and 2023. Sorry, I can only look down here. Does that make sense? So vast. By the way, at the same time, the number of institutional support systems within schools and universities has increased dramatically. Moreover, all sorts of attempts at regulating emotions like anxiety and depression have been made, some successful, some quite unsuccessful. So universal school-based interventions belong to the latter case. These are two, I love randomized controlled trials, by the way, in experimental methodology, much as I have a background in epidemiology and longitudinal data. But for these questions, you do need to use, as much as possible, randomisierte, kontrollierte Studien, nicht wahr? So, youth-aware mental health, people said this is the answer, What we found in a big study, people found in a big study was not only wasn't it significant, not only weren't people who were getting this intervention, which was an awareness, mental health awareness intervention, talk about your feelings and all that kind of stuff, not only did it not help, it made things worse. Same thing for the guide, made things worse. Not massively, but a bit, substantially. Right? This led us, another one. So can I tell you a story? We spent some time in America. We were working at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, and we have 3 daughters. And one day, our daughters were going to the public school system, the state school system there, which is supposed to be brilliant. So one day, I come back home from work, and my eldest daughter is doing some kind of stuff which looked quite disconcerting to me. Like sitting there, like this, and kind of saying some things. So, what are you doing, darling? What was she doing, do you think? Mindfulness, much to my horror. And I said, where did you learn that from? She said, I was taught this at school. I said, how on earth, why on earth does a school promote mindfulness in school children without trial data yet? By the way, I think mindfulness is great for some people and for some conditions, so don't get me wrong. But why in school children? Anyway, some very good colleagues in Britain did a study. And again, the study, not only didn't it show that it didn't help, but there was also some evidence, which I point out here. Sorry, it's not drawn from Department of Education data. This is actually this publication by Will Kiken. but it also may have been causing some harm. Some of the indicators showed that people were doing worse. And this was a big, properly powered, nice RCT. So we wrote a few papers, you can read them with Lucy Folks, about iatrogenic harm. Iatrogenic for, it's not just, doctors who cause them, but, medical doctors, it's kind of all just unintended consequences, I guess. So you can read about that. So I have an issue with the standard model of regulation. I was going to present you with this model of regulation, which is temperature regulation. It's the kind of, body temperature regulation system or other sort of closed loop type systems which you get in with your Heizung at home, your kind of heating system. So, but I was running this morning across the Neckar, which is very beautiful, and I saw somewhere it was saying, you can't change the wind, but you can trim your sails. Man kann nicht den Wind, aber man kann die Segel irgendwie justieren oder wie auch immer. Das hört sich sehr, this sounds very profound and very important. But then I reflected and I thought, oh, here we go, same regulation problem again. And my issue with this is that this model, this is the wrong metaphor, I would say, the sailing metaphor. Why? Well, because I think that this is on the left-hand side. I'm suggesting a new one on the right-hand side. The individual is seen as a recipient of environmental stimuli, whereas I will be arguing that people, including young people, are co-creators of their own environment in quite some substantial ways. There's a successful regulation that happens around an ought value, but we need to realize that there's not one ought value. There are many, and some of them have antinomies. They go against each other, and resolution of antinomies becomes very, very important. Pathology is seen as a deviation from that ought value, and I use pathology here loosely, the kind of not regulating, call it whatever you like, and resides in either excesses from the environment or a defect somehow where you're not doing very well, in the person. But instead of thinking of defects and deficits, one ought to understand incentives, power structures, and the need for dynamic adaptations to the environment. Okay, so let's just think briefly about two conditions. ADHD. Why are there ADHD traits in the population? Have you asked yourselves? Are they there in order to annoy teachers or doctors? Why do we have ADHS-Symptome in der allgemeinen Bevölkerung? Why? Why? Well, there are there's a summary there, but you can find much better ones. There is an evolutionary story to be told about these. You can simulate these evolutionary stories. There's some very neat mathematical models you can come up with. But the idea is, and some of it is post-hockery because you can't turn back time, but it is good post-hockery, is that it is adaptive, either at the individual or at the group level, or both. Right? Can you imagine where being inattentive or being fidgety might be good? Can you think of environments where impulsivity might be quite good? Do you have a question? Yes. Oh, no. Oh, sorry, it was a rhetorical one, but I'm very happy for you to answer it, yes. Shall I come down and attempt that? Sorry. No, I'm glad to be taken literally. I usually take things literally too.
As a good student, we always answer the questions if the teacher asks something, so... Well, that's quite funny. So I think there's research actually that in child with some traumatic experiences in the early childhood, or just like many stressors in the early childhood, they're more likely or more prone to get ADHD. So I would say if there's a group and there's like many risks, then that's very good to be very attentive. So evolutionary, if there are like many predators, then that would be something where it's very good to, be very reactive to every surrounding. So that's something that you have with ADHD. So you're very reactive to everything around.
Thank you. Well, you've done my job. Thank you very much. Applause again, please. Thank you. So that's one thing. But let me on that bit. One of my kind of papers. I didn't put it in there. Sorry, I thought it had copied. Do people know about this research with the Maasai famine? from De Vries. Anyway, children with difficult temperament, children who were very irritable, right, reizbare Kinder, were more likely to survive, according to that study, during a famine. Why would they be, the stats, were not perfect, but because the numbers were small. But take it as, why would that be? Because they elicited carer responses at the time. So traits have some adaptive value. Okay. Now, I'll give you some very simple background now on some basics about mood and emotions. And I think the first bit, will be fairly uncontroversial. The mood, the way we feel in the moment is an integration of recent values, expectations, and values. So this is important. Every time you enter into an environment, you carry with you expectations. When you came here, you came with an expectation, right? And then you get some outcomes. You get what the reality is. So what you get is, you can integrate over positive events, neutral events around 0, and negative events. And divide this by the total number of events. This is a very simple average, right? So mood at any given moment in time is proportional to a long-term expectation, it seems. So the important thing, though, is it is dependent on what we call surprises. Don't be put off by the maths there. I've put it in plain English. It is positive surprises, so the difference between what you expected and what you got, and negative surprises, right? These are all surprises, Überraschungen. And then there is the actual value of what you get. Both are very important at any given moment in time for what we get. Does that make sense? Does that seem plausible? You can show that, you can fit very nice models as we do and show that, it seems to be true both across monetary, money-related rewards, and social rewards. Now, what happens when you're in a classroom, though, and you feel like there are no stimuli? This is how I often feel. I feel understimulated. So what happens? Well, that then creates a situation. This was work we did following some of the work I showed before. And what we find is that people's mood declines. So as you wait, initially I called it passage of time dysphoria. As you wait, your mood gets worse and worse over time. Now we call it mood drift over time. Now, what we think is, and kind of your mood, your happiness goes down, your frustration goes up during that time. Why would that be? Well, in the absence of actual stimuli, what you're probably having is a situation of opportunity cost. I am stuck here listening to this guy when I could be outside and enjoying the good weather, for example. This would be an occasion of an opportunity cost, right? So the same thing is you're stuck somewhere and you can't get out. Does that make sense? Okay, so moving on. Now, the thing is, I've always been wondering about this. I've been wondering why, when you have a threat, if I suddenly kind of, I don't know, if fire came out of my mouth or I started shouting at you, how would I be able to predict whether you would be responding with fear or you'd be responding with anger? So this is a question that I've always been wondering about. And I've been wondering this about because I was thinking, who becomes the hero who goes up and fights versus someone who runs away? This was my childhood question, which transformed into an experiment later on. So the experiment, there's been follow-ups on this. It's very simple. You create a threat. In this case, we used a video of threats, and threatening sort of stimuli. And in one situation, you had a weapon that you could find. So there were zombies, and you had some weapon to do something against the zombies. And the other one, you had no weapon, right? Or you had a pen or something like that, which you couldn't use as a weapon. The interesting thing about this is the following. First of all, as you might expect, when you have a weapon, right, and you have this threat, and you're asked, are you going to fight? As you would expect, people are more likely to fight if they have a weapon, right? Does that make sense? This is pretty self-evident, right? But the important, and less likely, obviously, right, if they didn't. But the important thing here is that they were more likely to be angry if they had a weapon. And I should add, more likely to feel fear if they didn't have a weapon. And they escaped. I'm saying this again. The way you will respond to a threat, according to this experiment and a series of the ones we've done before, in terms of your feelings, is you will use feelings that are congruous to the affordance you have, the weapon, and your choice to fight or not. The effect of a stimulus on emotions is causally impacted upon by what we call environmental affordance. In circumstances that favor fighting, anger is more likely expressed. Well, I've said all this. So anger increases is maximal when affordances and choices align. So emotional expression is not just stimulus dependent, it's dependent on what is available to you. Emotions, and therefore also emotion regulation has clear instrumentality. You want to achieve, and I'll show you some other examples of this as well, you want to achieve something in your environment that aligns with your choices, and you choose, and I use this word quite broadly now, not necessarily as a conscious choice always, and you choose your emotion. So a description of emotions should also involve an approximation of power relationships. Consider a taxonomy where power affordances are a dimension of classification. This is extremely important in places like the classroom, I would argue. The other thing which is related to that is that our mood shapes the environment. It's obvious from the previous one, but if you're in an interaction with someone, the other person kind of shouts at you, what will you do? Immediately, right, there's an effect upon you. So we co-create our environment in very important ways. So a child's tantrum influences parental responses very famously, and we all know that, and increases the likelihood that people will give in to a demand, and can in its own right be reinforced. There are several examples of this, right? These are that are quite well described in the literature. Typical Pattersonian cycles of child throwing a tantrum, parent refusing, child escalating the tantrum, and what does the parent do? Can give in, in which case, things will calm down, or can resist that and actually regulate themselves and the child. But the important bit here, here's the temperament and infant mortality in the Maasai. So does that make sense? So people have an effect on their environment with their mood, and people consciously and unconsciously use that. A boss uses that by using an autocratic system because it works in the short run at least, right? To be dictatorial and quite aggressive. Doesn't so well in the long run. More structurally, we should always be reminded of what is called gene-environment correlation and what is called evocative gene-environment correlation. Are people familiar with this term from genetics? I'll put it very simply. If I am a child with ADHD, for example, right, I am much less likely to sit still, at least in a traditional classroom. If so, I will learn less. My teachers will turn against me. I'm just making it a bit of an extreme case. I am more likely to be impulsive and get into trouble when I'm out there. The police is more likely to come and get me. Can you see where I'm getting at? So you're evoking something in your environment. You're evoking your own environment. This can be in a good way as well. If I'm always very well behaved and all that, my environment will always like me, which is also not good for me. Now, humans choose useful emotions over pleasant emotions. There is this idea, and I blame Bentham for this, that people are happiness maximizers. That what we want to do is maximize our happiness. And I think it is a very unfortunate fact that in the last 10 or 20 years, people have been placing so much importance on happiness indices without useful contextual understanding. People want to feel emotions that prepare them for certain situations. There's this very nice work by a German group. This lady's called Riediger. You may know her very well. I don't know her personally. I just know of her work. Who's spoken about contra-hedonic motivation. And I think it's very important. So people do things that are unpleasant because they want to achieve something. And this is extremely important to remember. And adolescents are more likely to do things that are unpleasant than adults are in order to achieve something. And she has a taxonomy for this. You don't need to disentangle this. I mean, the paper is there. This is another paper from an Israeli group. I think this was when she was in America. This lady Tamir. The other interesting thing is how you feel and how you respond to certain situations is co-constitutive of selfhood. I said I didn't like selfhood, but the representation you have of yourself. And people, again, and you can see this in patients, and this is where I was inspired for this by, because people are not happiness maximizers and they have goals. One of the goals they have, we all have, is what? Is to be consistent within ourselves. It is very hard for human beings to consider themselves as non-consistent. It's something that we really find hard to kind of hear from others, that we're not consistent. So the human beings try to minimize those distances, those arrows you see, between the idea they have of the working self and the representation of themselves. And emotions fall into that category. You just need to think of phenomena like emo culture, what used to be emo culture some years back, there's other phenomena now, but also what happens with patients or what happens with, personhood in psychopathology, where people are, people's understanding of themselves is as someone who is profound, serious, not frivolous, melancholic. And these are seen as advantages. Does that make sense? So selfhood can be quite important, and the way we feel has to conform with that. Another term that I hope you're familiar with is how people regulate their emotions in order to meet societal norms, right? So emotions are a commodity, particularly in the era of capitalism that we live in, which is essentially a post-industrial era of capitalism, where services are very important. So if you're a waitress, a nurse, or a doctor, or something like that, you want to be unfailingly smiling and polite. A concept that Ari Hochschild, the sociologist, called emotional labor, quite successfully. And it's a very important concept. And it's quite energy-consuming as well. Some other things which are funny are that negative emotions seem to be forging social bonds. People will have heard from the olden days when there were wars in Europe, which unfortunately we may have to face again at some point. People would have heard the stories in various countries of, how Frontkämpfer, people who were fighting in the front, were coming together quite a lot, and there was a glue that made them stick together. And people have studied this notion of negative experiences bringing people together. And this is extremely important in social dynamics. And some people do that. Actually, in this paper, or in another paper by this guy, Whitehouse, there are those photographs of people who in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, in some of the Brazilian schools, kind of flagellate each other with their jiu-jitsu belts as a means of kind of initiation and bonding. So I'm coming towards the end. Why care about regulation? I said to you a little bit about why it is important. I mentioned to you all the issues that we have with regulation and the fact that what you and I might find good regulation may not be good regulation for the young person or anyone, in fact, and that there is likely to be conflicts, and those conflicts arise out of conflictual norms. And no matter how much science you do, and I do quite a fair bit of it, there is inherent inexactitude with norms, and societal norms determine a lot of what people choose and will choose. And it is often conflictual. I think the standard model that we have, the heating system model or the sailing model, is a good heuristic and has served us well in clinical practice. I can say that for sure, up to an extent. Individual regulation can be usefully seen as faulty, but it misses a great range of motives for regulation and understanding of adaptive processes. I am particularly worried that human creativity could be stunted by trying to bring everything to a common, to a form of self-regulation through various means. Dissent is extremely important. It risks imposing regulation, indeed, that contradicts adaptation, and it can be unfair by emphasizing or overemphasizing individual ability to adhere to a singular ought. Now, we need to think about what academic pressures there are at the moment. What pressures, and I think you will hear about it later on attentional processes and the economy of attentional processes in young people. I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, not at all, but it is a factor that needs to be taken into account. And what are the narratives around not coping with pressures? My perhaps biggest worry is one of pathologization. It's an ugly word and an ugly thing to do. So basically, and you can use any language you like. You can use the regulation language, you can use nosology's language to say that you are X. And I think this is problematic for various reasons because it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It happens within an environment at the moment that gives undue emphasis, in my opinion, to emotions and the expression of emotions. Many people will say, it's so good to express your feelings. This is the sort of, this idea, this misunderstood Freudian idea of this being a boiling kettle. So I, as a psychiatrist who works on emotions, I don't think that expressing your emotions is a good idea all the time. But Nike seems to be thinking otherwise. They're saying your feelings are valid no matter what. You have a right to feel whatever emotion you like. Can you see the problem with that, if everyone can feel the emotion they like? The issue is that normativity is now grounded in emotions. And I think this is a big problem. I feel, therefore I am, would be Descartes' current model. And I'm worried about that. What are the main social trends in society? I strongly recommend to everyone to read Andreas Reckwitz, Gesellschaft der Singularitäten. If you haven't, Society of Singularities. There's a shorter version as well previous to that, which is perhaps easier to read. I think he's the new Max Weber, so he's worth reading in terms of the singularization process. I'm also going to mention some things that Nick Haslam describes as concept creep, with things like trauma or well-being and all that kind of stuff. So ways in which terms that were quite a lot more restricted are now being used quite widely. Again, in keeping with the notion of undue pathologization. I need to say this because people often misunderstand this. There are many people who ought to get services and our help who are not getting it, particularly in disadvantaged strata of society, and that's scandalous, it's bad. But there's also a lot of people who are getting help, particularly in Western societies, and in certain strata, upper strata in Western societies, and they shouldn't be, and there's iatrogenic harm. That's my opinion. So I think we need a neuroscience that moves beyond the standard regulation model. We need and that's not easy because it requires co-regulation models that are far more advanced conceptually and mathematically, actually, and require a lot more statistical resources. We need a nosology Krankheitslehre, that integrates environmental contingencies and interplay between the person and the environment rather than seeing the person as a passive recipient like a sail in the wind or a boat in the wind. And I think that was my last slide. So, yes, I'm finished now. Shall I?
Thank you, Professor Stringaris. And I would like to welcome up again on the stage Professor Green, because we will have Also wir werden jetzt noch die Möglichkeit haben, eben in den Austausch zu kommen. Genau, mit beiden Keynote-Speakern hier auf der Bühne. Ich freue mich sehr. Und Anna geht auch wieder rum und sammelt gerne Fragen ein. Deswegen einmal melden und dann haben wir jetzt noch die Möglichkeit, auf beide Impulse einzugehen. hier vorne, Anna, hier, Tisch. Da.
Würden Sie uns verraten, wer Sie sind und an wen Sie die Frage richten?
Yeah, so I'm Freya de Bock from Charité University Medicine, and I have a question for the last speaker. So you said that we should, let's say, interpret ADHD and its increase, let's say, of the last decades as adaptive, evolutionary adaptive. So please, perhaps you can elaborate on what it means, because I have understood that you say it's better for creativity, let's say. It's something that helps people to be creative, and if we lose it by over-regulating, I think, then we lose this creativity. But perhaps you could...
Of course. So, first of all, it's not clear entirely, actually. ADHD may be one of the disorders which has not shown an increase in diagnosis over the last few years, nor is there an increase in the epidemiological prevalence of the usual kind of random population subsample prevalence of ADHD. So I don't think ADHD is quite a likely candidate for the increase that we see in the last few years, that we see for anxiety and depression. So that's one thing to say. The second thing is the adaptiveness of traits like ADHD, and I think it's not just ADHD, like take obesity. Obesity is an adaptive trait at some point, right? I mean, it makes sense. So common traits tend to be like that. For reasons that I can go into in terms of genetics and evolutionary pressures. So inter-individual differences in attention and in activity and impulsivity will serve some adaptive trait. Now, in certain environmental circumstances, those can become very problematic. There's no doubt about that, right? For example, if my environment expects of me to be sitting still, for example, through a conference for several hours, it's very difficult. Then that, no matter how good I might be in battle or whatever else I might be good at, that won't serve me very well. Does that make sense? So it's as simple as that. Now, whether ADHD is creative or not, I think that's an empirical question, right? There's some evidence that it could be. There's other traits that for sure could contribute to creativity. There's some good literature actually in terms of in terms of traits around mania and verbal IQ, for example. So that's my thesis. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Yeah? Okay.
Nächste Frage hier. Verrat uns kurz, wer du bist.
Hello, my name is Benedikt Knillmann. I'm from the Lower Saxony Student Council. First of all, thank you both for your presentations. I have a question to Professor Green. So you said we need, everyone has to learn on themselves to be autonomic. But on the other hand, we have to track everything down, to monitor everything. So I think if you would track me down and every cursor click I do, I won't feel very autonomic. So how does that fit together?
Great. So tell me if I'm getting your question correctly. I think you're asking, how do we help students develop good automatic skills while at the same time asking them to be paying attention to what's happening and monitoring so they can adjust accordingly?
Is it autonomy?
Right.
Autonomy, not autonomy.
Okay, autonomy. So okay. So I do think that, and again, if I'm not heading in the right direction, then you tell me. So we want students to have a level of autonomy. We want them to have the choice to engage in learning, to decide what they want to do when and how and in what ways. And we also want them, as we just heard about, to be able to work with others in ways that benefit the group. And so that is a balance that they need to learn how to do. Part of that balance is about monitoring oneself and recognizing kind of how one is engaging with others and adjusting that accordingly. And the more you do that kind of work, the easier it gets to do it in a fairly automatic and choice-based way. And so the practice element of self-regulation is really important because it allows you more mental bandwidth to not only understand how you're feeling, but understand how you're interacting with others and the environment to optimize all three. And so I think it is this process of developing a real facility for self-regulation that allows you more opportunity, whether you're with yourself or with others. Have I captured what you were asking about?
Moment, wir holen das Mikro nochmal.
Maybe it's not about what you really monitor and how it's done, but I think the teacher would monitor me. The teacher would track me down, and as a student, I wouldn't feel very nice in the classroom when I know, okay, the teacher knows everything about me, and I think that's not completely working together with this thought of autonomy you should have in the classroom.
Okay, thank you. I apologize that I didn't catch all of that. So whether we are using advanced techniques to understand what students are doing in a classroom or teachers are simply observing that, everything we do is meant to be in service of the student and what they want. And so we would never do something with a student where we over-observe them or we gather data about them in ways they don't wish. And so it really is in partnership. But what we try to do is explain the advantages of that to them in ways that hopefully they find useful, and if they don't, that's okay too.
Dankeschön. Thank you.
Wir sind ganz hier hinten.
Ja.
Sag kurz, wer du bist, ja?
Kann ich auf Deutsch reden?
Ja, du kannst auf Deutsch sprechen.
Okay, ja, hallo, mein Name ist Abdul Karim Sarko, ich bin von der Landesschüler- und Vertretung Rheinland-Pfalz. Und ja, meine Frage lautet, wie können wir Mitschülerinnen dabei helfen, weniger Ablenkung und Emotionen überwältigt zu werden und stattdessen proaktiv mit Schulstress umzugehen zum Beispiel oder ja generell sowas. Gibt es etwas, wie wir als Jugendliche auch da mit beitragen können oder ja, müssen das unbedingt jetzt wirklich Forscher und Gelehrte machen?
Mhm. Ja, Dichter und Denker.
It's a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Importance of the peer group, maybe.
Yeah.
Also, yeah.
So I love that, and we very much want students working with other students to help them be successful. And so if we can create the best models are the people that feel closest to us, right? So if we see others like us engaging in positive ways in classrooms, or if others like us are helping us engage in positive ways, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we want. And so it's very much our interest to work with teachers and work with students so that they all can better understand what self-regulation looks like, how it may look different for different people based upon their own preferences, and they can support one another in ways that help everyone be successful. So I love the idea of students helping students, and part of our work is about helping students develop the knowledge to do that as well. So one thing that we didn't talk about as much here is co-regulation, which was mentioned in the previous speaker's work, and social regulation. So we can actually help students become better teammates, better collaborators, better supporters of each other. So 100% on board with that.
Dankeschön. Gibt es auch mehr Fragen, Pulse? Hier
ja.
vorne, genau.
Ich eile und komme auf meine Schritte. Sagen Sie uns kurz, wer Sie sind, ja?
Hello, my name is Celine Chazala-Bauer. I'm here for a pro bono initiative on bringing brain literacy to the classroom, but actually my day job is working in internal security for the EU Commission. And there I have a question, because we talk a lot about success factors, achieving goals, opportunities, and I would be interested to know whether you're also looking into dangers and constellations where we are actually derailed and actively derailed, and not only because we're not focused or looking at a bird outside, but I'm thinking about companies capitalizing on outrage, fear, social exclusion, things like cognitive warfare, radicalization, online fraud, looking into urgency bias, fear, greed, etc. Looking at data from the World Economic Forum, for example, saying that disinformation and social polarization are actually one of the top 5 short-term risks. So is there anything you do in this regard to make students more resilient?
I've talked a lot. Do you want to say?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you said, there's a lot about mis and disinformation. I would say that it doesn't even need to be mis or disinformation. I've written a paper this end of last year showing that information in its own right can be problematic, even if it is correct information. Then we have the conceptual bits there, and we've also kind of run an analogy to epidemics in infectious diseases. We've run some differential equation modeling kind of simulations where you can track why that might be the case. And that's particularly true with healthcare systems. So even information that is good, if there's too much around, can be problematic. Now, but as I said, we can talk more about that. The bit about the disinformation is the following. Because of what I said about emotions, because emotions are not just things that are being passively felt, but are being felt and have an effect on the environment, hijacking people's emotions is a fantastic opportunity for everyone to achieve things, right? And if they can hijack your anger, for example, right, your rage, then all the better. So there will be, and because emotions can be reinforced and you can work through actually not so sophisticated models about how to do that, right, how to reinforce certain emotions, and this is what many companies exploit with rage, for example, this can become quite a powerful tool. This is not new, right? Politicians have been doing this through rhetoric for millennia. People view, I don't know, are there any historians here or philosophers? No? Well, it's always surprised me why Aristotle's kind of bit on emotions, famous treatise on emotions, is in the rhetoric. It was because as a citizen of that time, you were in politics, and as a politician, you needed to be able to speak to people's emotions. And I think that's what happens at the moment. So it's about being able to capitalize and hijack emotions in a very effective way. And this then multiplies and has effects in the real world. So recognizing that, I think, will be quite important. And not taking emotions too seriously, including one's own. And laughing about one's own emotions is actually quite a healthy thing to be able to do.
So to add to that, I am deeply concerned about technology and the ways in which it is either intentionally or unintentionally being used to manipulate the ways people feel, the ways they think, and the ways they interact with each other. And I am sympathetic to some degree to the, for example, social media companies that say, if we let you in to see our data, we are then revealing to you trade secrets that make our tools effective. So TikTok does not want us to know why their algorithm is so useful. I am somewhat sympathetic to that. However, the concerns are deep enough that I do not see why we should not be asking these companies to allow researchers in under non-disclosure agreements to examine the data, do research, and examine truly what is happening with people on these social media platforms and what can we learn about the ways they are actually affecting us. And that data does not need to get out of the companies, but the insights do. And I think it is time for our governments to seriously consider working with these companies to create environments where people from the outside can come in and understand what is happening and what do we need to do about it as a society.
Jeff, people may want to know that the digital. Do people know about the Digital Services Act? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it gives you some tools in that regard. Actually, they just need to be implemented. Right. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. No.
Yeah,
great.
Yeah. More questions?
More questions? Noch mehr Fragen? Erstmal nicht. Okay.
Dann, very well regulated.
Ja.
Surprisingly.
Dann vielen Dank. Thank you very much. Such an honor. Big applause for Professor Green and Professor Stringaris.